Jacksonville. The child was born but couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts for poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talked for hours. It was a barefoot history of this land of flowers.
From WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, our episode, The Week That Was. On the 7th of July, 2018. A bit of a programming note. Next week as DJ Trump embarks to England and to NATO, and finally on to the summit with Vladimir Putin. We'll have special coverage on BR on the World. Now, BR on the World has been around a long time. It is not as populated and known by people, but we will promote it up because it is the International Affairs program from WBRN Radio. Now, some would say, well, why do you have an International Affairs program? Part of the reason is that we can be a little more specific than we normally are, covering events of international importance. Now, I did not say just of American importance, but from the world as a whole. And as we progress, we've been doing this for a few years, BR on the World. As we progress, we'll do a much better job of covering the world, particularly events that are not covered well in the quote-unquote Western corporate media. Now, there are other sources, obviously, and we'll be looking to those sources to cover the world, as one will say, in the time that we have. Also, we have Numbers Man, that is our economics program that covers economy from a macro point of view. That will be this weekend. It is normally every weekend, and occasionally we have special programming there. And another open source report. What we've started to do here is promote open source meetups, those kinds of things, Library software and both hardware. And we've been working on that task, and also looking at security and the general state of the web as a whole. Now, when we do this topic, we not only do open source and library, we occasionally will go into the commercial software offerings, i.e. Windows. Windows 10 to be specific. The cloud, which there are a number of people there, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, etc. And iOS, that is the Apple implementation. And we also have Android. We spend a lot of time with Android. Android will be morphing, I suppose is the word, into an OS called Fuchsia. Fuchsia was named after, they named Fuchsia, I should say, after a flower in Japan. Now, it will be a non-Linux-based system, and very important that people understand this. The current system for Google is based on the Linux kernel, the Android system, various implementations of it. We are now, at 8.3, called Oreo, after the cookie, basically. And as that moves along, and the reason for this new OS is that Google can more commercialize their system. Let's put that simple. Anyway, enough of that. We have Uncle Carl here, Uncle Carl Robe. He's been traveling in Europe. We'll talk about his travels there. He's writing in the Wall Street Journal. Let me get that up. We usually like to start with Uncle Carl. We have to find Uncle Carl first here. And then we were looking at the sports. But we had Uncle Carl here. And how did Uncle Carl get away from us? Well, the best laid plans of mice and men. We're looking at the Great Falls Tribune. Maybe we'll get back to that. This the Great Falls Tribune, which we used Trump rally, a heck of a day for Great Falls. We'll look at it lastly here, and then now we'll. Some reason Uncle Carl got out of order here. Anyway, nonetheless, he's writing on the 5th of July in the Wall Street Journal. Can Trump and Europe cut a deal is the subject of his little polemic. We'll give him a polemic. Every 4th of July when I was growing up, my family would read the Declaration of Independence, or at least a stirring open verse from the framed copy that I still have. In recent years, I joined friends at their Austin, Texas Hilltop House to eat fried chicken and watch fireworks light up the skies. Well, that's commendable. Carl probably shouldn't eat too much fried chicken, but anyway, this year I was traveling in Europe, far away from the familiar Independence Day ritual of home. I had to make do with reading Jefferson's rousing words on a laptop in Nice, France. If there were fireworks on the Riviera, they were celebrating a wedding, not American independence. France's critical role in the Revolutionary War. Still, the holiday leads to conversation in Europe with friends about my home country's conditions. One perspective... Italian remarked that the world needs an America that is economically and militarily strong. He should be reassured by the boosting the U.S. economy and Washington's recent increase in defense spending. Neither, however, erased the concerns about America's commitment to the so-called Western Alliance. Well, the Western Alliance is an outgrowth of Wilsonian foreign policy. Extension, that was Woodrow Wilson, the racist president. But that went on particularly after the war, the Great War, World War II. That was when FDR was there. And there was alliance with the Soviet Union and alliance with England, etc., and they had an alliance also with the Soviet Union, the USSR. Europe was decimated, no doubt about it, and so was Japan. So in other words, the U.S. was the only economy going at the time. It had shifted to a wartime economy, which means that the defense industries in the country had replaced much of the civilian output of production. And those factories were humming 24/7. And after the war, they had to be converted back to civilian use, that is in the U.S., but still supplying the world. And Japan, under General MacArthur, he was the person that they occupied Japan. And Germany was also basically at the time a U.S. military district. And manufacturing had to be restored. Now, not all the plants were decimated. Japan served as a proxy at the time for goods that could not be made in the U.S., primarily due to expense. Organized labor was much better organized at the time in the 40s and into the 50s before McCarthy came in, a convenient time. The red baiting was done for a purpose, to stop the union movement and to stop progressives. This falls under the cover of anti-history. Thus, you had a turbulent situation there. Harry S. Truman was the president. And as the nation started to come back economically, ushered in I Like Ike. Those were days primarily, with the exception of civil rights. The nation was out playing links golf. Ike was an avid golfer, a much better one than DJ Trump. But the nation was still under the influence of primarily men and some women, but mostly men, that it had the experience of the quote-unquote Great War, World War II. And prior to World War II, some of the old-timers were still around. Like Ike started out in the cavalry. So it was a different situation, a different mindset at that particular time, and a different way of looking at Europe. Then came the Cold War, where the U.S. Capitalist class saw that they were competing with the USSR, thus started the build-up. And that's where NATO was born. There's some of the history there. These concerns back to Uncle Carl loom large given DJ Trump's trade agenda and foreign policy. If Trump further disparages the North American Atlantic Treaty Organization at the alliance meeting next week in Brussels, then indulge the Russian President V.I. Putin shortly after in Helsinki, Finland. The summit, the Europeans' worst fears will be confirmed. Well, part of DJ Trump's American First policy is to refocus the American foreign policy on America. And what that basically means is the American nation would be more, quote-unquote, isolationist. Now, that came before Wilson and the Wilsonian foreign policy. Was more international, but it was international from an America first, or America exceptionalism, let's just say that. That even went into the Obama administration. So when you start weighing these two on the scale of history, where do you find yourself? Period. With the colonial powers in Europe, the British, that it caused confusion across the African continent and into Asia. France and their colonies in Africa now still causing problems in Mali and places of that nature. And Germany trying to hold a manufacturing fort together in Europe against reaction. And at the same time, Europe is now facing a sea of reaction that they have not seen since the days of Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler. But what that basically means is, equates out to, if you look at many of the states across Italy, for instance, they have not had the best economic times, and part of that is the global trade setup. Not the tariffs on their products, but their inability to integrate themselves into the quote-unquote New World Order. We have to bring George H.W. Bush in. those are some of the things there. And of course, you have England, Britain, or whatever you want to call it, the UK, in a position that it's tried to hold on to since the Second World War. But economically, it's not set up to do that. The right-wing movement that pushed in Brexit had separated England from the rest of the EU, primarily as they try to separate. Their economy is not strong enough to do it. Banks are moving out of the City of London. Now, the City of London is separate from London. And DJ Trump has figured that out, so when he goes to England, he will stay in the countryside with the fox hunters. So those are some of the things that are changing in a worldwide economy. That you have other players in now. You have China, for instance. You have India. They have a B in people. India's big problem has been infrastructure and their caste system there. They can hurt a nation, as what happened in this country with a city like St. Louis. That was a gateway to the West, had something going for it, third or fourth largest city at the time. And then they had their race riots, and they never recovered. That's one of the lessons of history out there. Let me finish with Uncle Carl here. Concerns Luma anyway. On the other hand, perhaps Trump and allies and advisors say it's true that the president strongly supports free trade. Watch the word free trade. There is no such thing. As long as the playing field is level, it'll never be level. Only in a classroom that economics professors rant and rave against the monopolies going back to Adam Smith. The NATO rhetoric is meant to prod allies into raising their defense spending to 2% of gross national product, to which each NATO country has committed. After all, even if the president's rhetoric hadn't always been tough on Russia, the administration's actions have been. Mr. Trump's NATO threats and new tariffs on EU imports are negotiating ploys. Well, we'll make a comment on that in a minute. Maybe Europeans should respond in good faith. They could offer a deal. The EU would reduce tariff on American cars to match what the U.S. charges on European autos. In return, Trump would drop his steel and aluminum tariffs. So European leaders could present credible plans to meet the long-standing pledge on defense outlays. Well, part of the problem on defense outlays that you have a phony commitment. There is no military threat in Europe as such. Now, let me just separate that out from some of the nations that used to be in the Soviet bloc. Those nations are tied economically to the Russian Federation, and due to ethnic groups, etc., they're a different situation. Would the Russian Federation invade Finland, for instance, where Helsinki is? The answer to that is no. So you have a made-up situation, the same with England and with Germany. Those things can be looked after properly. The Allies can take some comfort. The Americans still support democracy, and Uncle Carl should watch how he uses the word democracy. With the stepped-up voter suppression in the U.S., the stepped-up stage of the American immigration laws that had been in place for over 50 years. They were primarily brought about, I'm talking about the limits to people coming into the country. At one time, there was a virtual ban on people coming in from China and from Asia. European countries had quotas. The Irish, the Italians came in when they needed, quote-unquote, the labor supply, basically speaking, and many Germans. But this is the early 1900s, when the nation was an agricultural nation. After the war, those quotas were changed. And as far as quotas from the other parts of America, i.e. Central Latin America, Mexico, etc., that was pretty much non-existent. except in L.A. they had a guest workers, in California, guest workers program at one time. And when the labor of people from south of the border was not needed, they were literally deported. That has been the history of immigration there. So when you have people coming over the border, that's not a new phenomenon. But it is in the sense that due to social media, due to consolidation of communication systems, cable, television, radio, etc., now people hear about this. But for a majority of American people, it is no more than a distant ringing in the ear. If you live in Peoria, you're not concerned. Now, what has happened is the balance of power in a city, say like Chicago, due to immigration in, particularly of Latinos, the balance have changed, and also policy there under Emmanuel, that African Americans have in neighborhoods have been gentrified. African Americans are forced out. In some neighborhoods where Latinos have moved in, they have not gentrified those neighborhoods as of yet. So thus the Latino population has increased in Chicago. And it's due to a number of things. Obviously, the gentrification program under Emmanuel and under the second mayor, Daley, and the weak political situation with the African American vote after Harold Washington. It was splintered, or what we'd say in information technology, forked. So numerous people split up after their own personal interests. And that came out of the heavily populated, or heavily part of the churches, that ministers saw an opportunity to make money, persuading their congregations to vote or not to vote for one particular faction. And thus in Cook County, these characters for individual gain destroyed the African American vote in Chicago. And then, of course, when African Americans left Chicago, that is the state of affairs there. So when Emmanuel ran for re-election, Dewey Garcia ran against him. He came up short, but not by much. There were other candidates put up against him, all kinds of kooks. They had one Republican kook that was there. He even tried to run for county commissioner. Again, I forget against who her name was. But nonetheless, this is the state of Chicago politics. A state that is has, as they say, diminished the authority of African Americans in Chicago and in Illinois. New work has to be done, and of course, while we're on this, the Illinois Democratic Party moved to the right because of Emmanuel, etc., and thus became disorganized. Now they have Remus in as the governor. A pathetic situation in Illinois, a union state. And this has happened time and time again. This is what happened in Michigan. So we go too far off of what is going on here. But U.S. allies can take note. We left the global engineering. 87% believe that when other countries become democratic, now that depends. It contributes to our well-being, according to an April 8 poll sponsored by Freedom House. That tells you the G.W. Bush Institute and so-called Penn Boehner Center for Diplomacy, Global Engagement. 67% said that democracy abroad often helps make the U.S. A little safer, while just 22% said there was no impact on U.S. security when countries move away from quote-unquote dictatorships. According to a May poll from Pew, support for free trade is at 56%, the highest in 3 years. Still, some Americans supporters in Europe have deep concerns. My Italian friend was most worried about whether my countrymen, he didn't say country persons or country people, still believe in the American dream. Well, obviously they don't at the White House. If you work hard, you can achieve happiness and prosperity. Happiness and prosperity has nothing to do with American capitalism. Or working hard, I should say. If Americans no longer believe that, he says there's little hope for the rest of the West, because the values of work, responsibility, and optimism are all eroding in Europe. Well, there's no doubt about that because of these right-wing movements. Right-wing movements by their very nature, and we saw this during the administration of Barack Obama, that they have to bring in a pessimism. If they bring in optimism, that would have meant that the Obama theme song, Yes We Can, would reign supreme across the nation. So they had to push the negative. And by pushing the negative, that moves the nation more to a negative state, and it brings in what the Trump people call alternative facts, fake news. That has replaced the Tea Party. The American sense of hopefulness and enterprise at the core of the American dream is still widespread. Not really. I don't have the numbers at hand when we talk, but a Gallup survey from January found 63% of Americans were satisfied with the opportunities for a person in this nation to get ahead by hard work. That is below the 76% who felt that way during the 9/11 caper. But still, it's above the 53% who did. And this is an indication in 2012 what actually happened there. So that is Uncle Carl and the European situation in a nutshell. Hopefully we were able to bring it into the proper perspective of so-called free enterprise and democracy, where you have massive voter suppression. And at the same time, the Supreme Court is dividing the nation by the wedding cake bill and by various other rulings where they have literally demolished the Voting Rights Act. That is not any form of democracy, period. And at the same time, being business friendly, that is not democracy. And people are now seeing that. Let's go to Southern California here. This is from the Washington Post. All-time temperature records set throughout Southern California, including Los Angeles, and this is some of the temperatures here. 114 in Hollywood, at the Hollywood Burbank Airport. Van Nuys Airport, 117. Santa Ana, 114. That's down in Orange County. Riverside hit 118, tying a record for 1925. Friday will be one of those record days for the record books. That's from the National Weather Service in Los Angeles. The service said all-time high temperature, 113 in Burbank, 117 in Woodland Hills, are in jeopardy. Downtown L.A. is forecast to soar to 106 degrees. Previous record was 95, set in 1992. The all-time temp there was 113 out in the desert. The heat dome affecting California is the same one that brought all-time records highs to Denver and Burlington, Vermont, and blamed for at least 44 heat-related deaths in southern Quebec in Canada. So this does have problems from Donald Swan. Is a client scientist at UCLA. That the clockwise circulation around the heat dome and resulting offshore winds will force air down in the mountain slopes and adjust to the coastal areas, and compressing and heating the air. This will likely be a high-impact, memorable heat event. Should all-time temperatures be set in Southern California, join a parade of others across the northern hemisphere. We'll look real quickly at Mr. Swan's blog here. Sweaterizing, but local weekend heat wave across Southern California. Heat slowly spreads north in the coming days. He's writing here on the 4th of July. The long anticipated shift towards dramatically warmer conditions will finally come to fruition this week. A lob of very strong upper level ridge that has brought record heat to areas from Denver to Boston in recent days will retrograde, slightly on Thursday and Friday. This regional enhancement of the ridge will lead to pretty unusual atmospheric setup across Southern California with deep southeasterly flows aloft, but easterly to even the northerly winds close to the surface. The patterns will result in local, quiet, strong offshore flows, which will combine with already very hot air mass aloft to produce strong compression heating in the downslope flow regions, which will impasse most of the major metro areas. Meanwhile, the deep southeasterly flow aloft will advent subtropical moisture from the east, resulting in increased humidity. That's something they usually don't have in California. Let me just finish this up. This will likely have a high impact and memorable heat event, despite the fact that it will largely be localized in Southern California's coastal strip. Northern California will not be especially hot this weekend, even with the inland desert region in Southern California will be hot, but not memorably so. But in Los Angeles, Santa Barbara counties, especially the heat from Friday through Sunday will be extreme due to localized effects of the downslope winds and associated compressed warming. Temperatures over 100 will be possible, even close to the beach, and just 5 to 10 degrees inland temperatures could approach 106. Meanwhile, Santa Barbara County, which will likely experience strong sundowners, humidity could be quite low on Friday as the events begin, but will rise to particularly uncomfortable levels by late weekend, where we should be now. The Weather Service expects widespread temperature records to be set in Southern California. So much for that one. Let's go back to Los Angeles and the abortion debate. This is from the Los Angeles Times. Surfaces in the California governor's race. The candidate for the Republicans, John Cox, argued that case of rape and incest should be no exception to the ban on abortion. I wonder was that when he was in Illinois. Anyway, this is an old hat for California. I think that anybody who has a rape or incest exception to abortion really hasn't thought it out. Killing the baby is not going to absorb the crime of rape. That's what Cox said at the Conservative Action Conference in Washington. That was 12 years ago. Evidently he hasn't changed his tune. With D.J. Trump's pending appointment to Supreme Court rekindling the nation's long-standing political clash over the issues, advocates on both sides foresee the court shifting to the right, as it already has, and overturning a Roe v. Wade. That was a 73 decision out of Texas, actually. Depending on what who Trump nominates, the issue starts to become an advantage for the Democrats, said Chapman, a political science professor. said, Chapman College, sorry about that, Laurie Cox Ham. For John Cox, there really is not any advantage at all. No doubt about that, he will remain in the 20s. Cox has cited his Catholicism there. Said his views on abortion were after learning that his father took advantage of his mother before the marriage. The couple later divorced. Yeah. I don't think we need to go back there. Cox wrote in a political position paper, Politicians, Inc., that was published in 2006. She didn't think God or so was born in my absolute opposition to abortion on demand. He's a wealthy businessman from Rancho Santa Fe, California, strongly opposes opponent of the death penalty. His personal positions on the death penalty and abortion are well known, but as governor, should he abide by the law? His campaign manager said in an email statement to the Times, Amy Everett, director of NARAD Pro-Choice California, said the differences between the two candidates for governor will be on the November ballot. No doubt about that. Cox never has been elected to office, has been consistent in one way, and there's an anti-choice leader there. California's lieutenant governor, former mayor of San Francisco, boasted during the gubernatorial climate about his efforts to raise money for Planned Parenthood. So, in other words, in California, they've had a long-standing situation there. Newsom also called for the state to increase Mid-Cal's reimbursement rates to healthcare providers, including Planned Parenthood, and provide a permanent $100 million allocation for reproductive health care from money raised by Prop 56. So this actually goes back. California was the first to legalize abortion. That was in 1967, before Roe versus Wade. That had been roughly about 5 years. These protections include the right for funding for abortion provided to women covered by Medi-Cal, that is their Medicaid, California's program. Still, a governor who opposes abortion process through executive authority to at least disrupt things there. So that is from Susan Fogel, Director of Reproductive Health and Justice Program at the National Health Law Program that is in Los Angeles. A governor could appoint any abortion director to the state health department. Decades ago, Dick Mason, who's dead now, made several cuts to the state family planning program. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, California's Constitution declares a clear-cut right to privacy, a legal foundation protecting women's rights to have a baby or legal abortion. So there are differences there, long-standing differences there. Cox, for example, could use his veto power to reject Senate Bill 320, pending legislation that require health clinics on University of California State campus to provide drug prescriptions for Medicaid abortions by 2022. Reasonable citizens of California will agree that our legislature is to the far extreme in promoting abortion. Still on the show, we're seeking a reasonable and critical balance. Forget it. Most Californians consider abortion to be a settled issue. And no doubt about that, it has been settled in California since 1967. A poll by the Public Policy Institute of California found more 70% of Californians believe government should not interfere with a woman's right to choose. 27% wanted to be more restrictive. And that's been consistent for the last basically 20 years. Let me just make sure. Well, we're here. This is from the Washington Post. Jumping back a pro-conservative student group out of Wheaton, Illinois, has scheduled a protest for this weekend, March for Our Rights. There have been various right-wing groups out here. The right-wing talk show host, Joe Walsh, who was a Republican congressman who has been defeated, would be at the Washington march there, and it'll be one of those little marches around. The ERA has sponsored. We just mentioned it here. Make sure that people get all of these things in here. Let me just jump back again to Montana. Initially extend Medicaid expansion nears the ballot qualification. This is Helena, Montana. Supporters of an initiative to extend Medicaid expansion through a tax on tobacco products will learn this month if it qualifies the November ballot. Backers turned in 40,000 signatures, well over the 25,000 needed for Initiative 185, would increase the cigarette tax by $2 to fund the state expansion of Medicaid, part of past its expiration date in 2019. Medicaid expansion now covers nearly 1 in 10 Montanans. We have seen stories of people who choose not to go to the doctor. They are living in severe pain, but it's either go to the doctor or not able to pay the heat. And in Montana, it's very important to pay the heat. According to Healthy Montana, the initiative would generate $75 million a year in revenue by 2023, about 5 years away. 185 also would fund other programs, veteran smoking prevention to help seniors stay in their homes. For supporters, equally important parts of the measure is tobacco tax, which they believe could cut down on smoking. It would have some effect there. The initiative has the backing of the governor, Bullock, the state hospitals, an array of groups including AARP Montana and the American Cancer Society's Action Network. And it would also be integrated into the budgets of rural hospitals, something notable, no doubt. Let me finish up here. Check our time here. Running a little over. Beyond Black Panther, thanks to a wave of homegrown filmmakers, Oakland is having a Hollywood moment. And they feature here the Warriors that swept the Cavaliers. Bucciarelli stepped out in the early sunshine. Smiling as strangers didn't take a double take as the rapper, activist, filmmaker moved down the street, a Bay Area icon known to the hip-hop heads since he put out his first record in 1991. With the local rap outfit, The Coup, Mr. Raleigh is a radical voice of anti-capitalist resistance, whom many have come to know during the Occupy movement. He strolls past small businesses that line a Grand Avenue, past florists, Thai and Chinese restaurants, long-time local watering holes, and newly hipster-type outfits. All along, the Oaklanders have, of all stripes, have stopped him, a cyclist out for a mid-morning ride, a businessman on lunch, a group of off-duty firefighters waiting outside a sandwich shop. We heard so much about his new film, sorry to bother you, set in and shot over the city last summer. They thanked him for Oakland, Reaping Oakland for writing a movie about Oakland and for making it here and celebrating the dimensionality of one of the nation's most diverse cities. Long in the shadows of the city, across the bay, a nest between liberal Berkeley and exploding tech expanse of Silicon Valley, Oakland's population is still 425,000, is in the midst of a long-awaited movie movement. Mr. Raleigh is helping put it on the map. His nickname, its nickname, The Town, is a nod to Oakland, standing in relation to San Francisco, known as a city. His nervy social satire, sorry to bother you, about a young African-American telemarketer named Cassius Cash Green, who must weigh his ambitions against his growing social consciousness. It could take place in many American settings, but the setting in Oakland adds razor-tipped speciality. When Cash discovers his sales superpower, for example, a white voice that sends commissions through the roof and alienates him from his co-workers and friends, he traded budget digs at his uncle's soon-to-be foreclosed house for a high-rise downtown cathedral building where the penthouse view besets the city. Mr. Raleigh, sorry to bother you, years ago assumed that he had to stage the homeless encampment he wrote into the script of filming last summer in Oakland. He found already in place. There are some artists that could move around from place to place. I traveled lots in my time around outside of the historic Grand Lake Theater Palace, built in 1926. We're sorry to bother you, as taunted on the East Bay's most recognizable marquee. But I've always come here because it actually makes my art make sense. For all the versatile locations and proximity to Hollywood, Oakland has rarely been portrayed on screen as vibrantly, as urgently as it has this year. Films including Marvel's superhero blockbuster, The Black Panther, Mr. Ellie's Sorry to Bother You, and the upcoming Blind Spot from Oakland, from Raphael Kossel and Devine Diggs. Don't mistake it for San Francisco, where tourist-friendly streets most recently played host to the shenanigans of Ant-Man and the Wasp. Smaller and half as populous and more ethnically diverse, the product of a 20th century industrial boom. Now the exit from working-class family artists and multicultural communities, new tech transplants. Oakland has always definitely held its own on the east coast of the San Francisco Bay. Now the city's social economic complexities and seismic battle over gentrification has come there, served as a microcosm for the time, allowing Oakland-centric films of 2018 to start wider conversations, possibly wind up in the Oscar race. According to Film Oakland, that is the city's film office, feature production was down in 2016. Commercial shooting consistently dominated over film production. Rare are filmmakers who shoot narrative films here, but those that do tend to inscribe the Bay Area they know and love onto screen. The Oakland-born filmmaker Ryan Coogler was one of the first to do that in his film Fruitvale Station, that was about the late Oscar Grant and his murder, and the drummer Kicks of a coming-of-age odyssey from the East Bay native Justin Tipling. Few films have translated local love into cinema on the scale of Coogler's Black Panther, which he and his co-writer Joe Robert Cole penned the original superhero. The film, incidentally, was for Oakland was filmed in Atlanta because it was cheaper to work there. Anyway, the Black Panther's opening scenes filmed in Atlanta thanks to George's tax credits. A few months later, however, Sorry to Bother You and Blind Spot came to Oakland, filming at the same time across the city. Blind Spot, the story of two Oakland, one BFFs, one black, one white, set against a backdrop of rapidly involving Oakland. Filmed on location was a must from the very beginning, meant to be about Oakland. And the producer, Jess Calder, who came across the spoken word artist Casual, etc. there. Let me finish this up. This is a longer article than we anticipated. And we'll append it anyway, but only going to happen with actual organization, he added. And the organization's people are scared of those. Hopefully that will change, and I think it will make the art movement more effective. This is a lady, Mumin, that wrote a script, and she'd like to get made that is set in Oakland's Mosswood Park. She hopes to shoot it on location all across the East Bay. Now let's do the sports now. We kind of ran a little over time. We try to run... Anyway, nonetheless, on Friday, the FEMA World Cup, France 2-0 over Uruguay. Brazil beaten by Belgium 1-2. So that was on Friday. Today, so France is in it, and today we have Sweden and England at 10. That's the early day. And then we'll have Russia and Croatia in the afternoon. To the baseball scores on Friday. The Reds were in Wrigley Field and beat the Cubs 3-2. Montgomery was a loser. Anyway, the Rangers and Tigers in Detroit. Tigers 3-1. The Mariners and Nationals 3-2. That was in D.C. The Marlins, I'm sorry, I call them Mariners. Anyway, the Phillies and Pirates 17-5. That's in very light there. Wish they would. What they do is they darken. This is ESPN. They darken the score anyway, or to 6. Anyway, the Yankees and Blue Jays in Toronto. Blue Jays 6-2. The Athletics were in Cleveland. Cleveland 10-4. The Rays and Mets in New York. Mets 5-1. Atlanta and the Brewers in Milwaukee. Close game there, 5-4 Brewers. They didn't drink as much beer. And the Orioles and the Twins in Minnesota, 6-2 Twins. The White Sox and Astros in Houston, was all Houston there, 11-4. The Red Sox were in Kansas City and beat the Royals at 10-5. Mr. Sale was a winner there. The Padres and D-backs in the desert. D-backs 3-1. The Dodgers and Angels, a battle, I guess, cross town, you'd call it now. Angels pulled that one out 3-2. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah. Walk-off home run on Kenley Jansen. He was a loser. Anyway, the Rockies and Mariners up in Seattle. It was all Rockies 7-1. And no doubt they were glad to be in Seattle, hopefully. The Cardinals and Giants, game we tuned into, a 3-2 game. The line score was Giants had 7 hits, the Cards had 5 hits and no errors. Excuse me. Mr. Smith got the save. That does it for sports. That will do it for the week that was on the 7th of July 2018 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. We will return on the Boston Red part on the Monday Morning Quarterback, taking a look at some of the talk shows and obviously the week ahead on DJ's Trump's tour of Europe. And we have an open source reporting, of course, Numbers Man, that is our economics production, will air this weekend also. So it's always a busy weekend around here. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on Monday morning.